Section 3, there is nothing new. There's really nothing new except for like one new concept. But everything else is the same as what you did in Section 1. It's kind of like a review already, which is a good thing. And I just wanted to highlight some terminology that your worksheet uses because we use the words interchangeably. When it asks for the maximum height, I just want the y value. What is the highest point of the graph? Where is that maximum occur? Where's the minimum? I want the lowest y value of the graph. If it says location, we are actually just looking for the x value. Kind of a funky thing because in my other class, location means an x and a y, x comma y. But on this worksheet, whoever wrote it, their location means at what x value does this occur for worksheet 3. It asks for X-Intercepts, and if you don't know what those are, that's where the graph crosses the x-axis. And a few hints to you, just as I showed you as we were going over homework. Your y-axis can be counted equally by anything you want. You don't have to go, oh, there's only 3 marks and I need to go 4. You can count by, the third mark can be a 4 if you want to. You can have the first mark be a 0.5 if you want to. As long as you go up 0.5 and down negative 0.5, you are just fine doing that. They just need to be equal. That's why that's underlined. If you go up by 4 units, then you go down by 4 units. Don't make those unequal, by the way. Your x-axis, on the other hand, that is something that you will have to determine based off of the period. And there's a formula for it that's in your notes for 7C number 2. It's 2 pi divided by b. You're expected to memorize that formula. You will use that formula for sine, cosine, even secant and cosecant as we get into the later sections in 4 and 5. Other things. If it says graph for 1 period, I just want 1 wave. If it says for 2 periods, I need at least 2 waves. And it doesn't matter which one you're talking about, whether you're talking about sine or cosine. It means 2 waves of each. The only thing that's new is this, these given intervals. They're going to give you an interval sometimes, and it's going to specifically state what you have to graph. Now, just because you are given some intervals does not mean that you have only graphing those things. They just have to include those values. I'll give you an example down here below. In this particular problem, it has a given interval. This is a given interval, just to show you. You don't necessarily graph everything, but you do have to graph between negative 2 pi over 3 to pi over 3. I'll show you how to do that in a little bit. But if you see something like this, they're telling you that your angles that you're graphing have to be between a given interval. That's what that means. That's the new stuff. You can include more if you need to. I would suggest to you that you're going to do 4 quartiles the same way we've been doing, and then add or subtract from the 4 quartiles whatever you need to fit the given interval. But the first quartile, sine and cosine, always begins at the y-axis. Don't forget that. Like, this is a big idea. It begins at the y-axis, so make sure you are still knowing that for the sine, it starts at midline on the y-axis. For cosine, it starts at the extrema. Positive, it's up here. Negative, it'd be down there, depending on what it is. So at this point, that's everything. Let's just review what you're going to do. I have 2 examples picked out for you to do. The first example is number 3. You can do it on your worksheet if you would like, or you can do it in your notes. It's up to you. So let's do number 3 together. And the first thing I want to point out to you about number 3 is that they have A through E. You're going to graph it, and then you're supposed to find certain points. So we're going to graph it, and then we're going to figure out what A, B, C, D, and E are. I would recommend ignore A, B, C, D, and E, and I would just start to graph the same way that we did before. So, remember how I told you you could label or count by anything you want? Since my A value is 1/2, what do you think I should count by? What do you think our y-axis is going to be? Make it easy on yourself. You can have that first line be 1/2. You can have that bottom be a negative 1/2. That's what I would do. If you wanted to, you could skip and go up here, and where I'm pointing at, you could have that be 1/2 if you wanted to. But if you do that, then down here you have to skip 2 and be negative 1/2 down here. I don't care. As long as you count it equally. Equal up, equal down. Now the B value helps determine the period. It's whatever's multiplying that x. Period equals 2 pi divided by b. You have a fraction in a fraction. I hope by now, if you are dividing by a fraction, that you know you can multiply by its reciprocal. I usually use a shortcut personally. I take the very, very bottom number, and I take that bottom number and I multiply it by the top number, and I get that this period is 3 pi. If you need a little bit of extra, two pi times by the reciprocal, you can always multiply by the reciprocal to see that that's what it becomes, by the way. So if my period is 3 pi, then I want you to make the fourth quartile 3 pi. Make this the fourth quartile. I'm going to put Q4 right next to it. Okay? That lets me know that the fourth dash should be 3 pi. First quartile, second quartile, third quartile, fourth quartile, 3 pi. Boom. Like that. Always label your x-axis. For me, I want you to label the fourth quartile and the second quartile every single time. 3 pi, what's half of 3 pi? Is 3 pi over 2. Don't feel like you got to put that into a decimal. Fractions are a little bit easier here, in my opinion. You may have to figure out Q1, and you may have to figure out Q3. If you do, then I would do just what I did here. How did I get half of 3 pi over? How did I get half of 3 pi? I took half of it, and I did 3 pi, and I took half of it, and I got 3 pi over 2. If I want half of that, that's this line, first quartile, you multiply the bottom by 2. It's 3 pi over 4. In case you need it, because we will need that to answer some of these questions down below. And then 3 pi over 4, this is the first quartile. The second quartile, the third quartile are 3 of these. 1, 2, 3. 3 times the 3 pi over 4. What is 3 times 3 pi over 4? It is 9 pi over 4. That's why I like to do it as fractions. It's easier, in my opinion. If I'm sketching the graph and this is a cosine graph, does it start with midline or extrema? Tell the person you're sitting next to. If you said extrema, you are correct. Does it start at the positive extrema or the negative extrema? Tell the person you're sitting next to. If you said positive extrema, you are correct. So I'm just going to put some dots. Extrema, midline, extrema, midline, extrema. And I'm going to just connect my dots. I go back and I read my directions. How many periods? Do I have one period drawn? Piece of cake. I'm done with the sketch. If it asks for 2 periods, which you will have to do later in some later problems, you're going to draw 2 of those waves, making sure you double whatever this period is, the 4th quartile period is. So now what do I have to answer? I have to answer part A, part B, part C, part D. Part A says give the maximum height. When it asks for the maximum, that's why we wrote this down. What do I want? I want the highest Y value. What is the maximum of this particular height? What's the highest Y value that it becomes? You can leave it as a fraction. If you put 0.5, that's fine, but 1/2 is fine by me. But it's 1/2 here, and it's 1/2 over at 3 pi. All you have to do, it's always the highest Y value it's ever going to be is 1/2 at the top, no matter where we are on it, no matter how many periods it is. It never gets higher than that. Part B, what's the minimum height? What's the lowest value that it's going to be? Do you know? If you know, tell the person you're sitting next to. I agree. I heard a lot of you say it correct. Part C, what's the location of the maximum height? And remember what I had you write down, the location at what X value does this occur? Where is the location of the maximum height? You might have to have 2 answers for the first period. If you know, write them down. I'll have you check your answer in a second. How many of you wrote 0 and 3 pi? Raise your hand. That is the majority of my class. Perfect. Part D, what's the location of the minimum height? 3 pi over 2. And lastly, where are the X-intercepts? Where does it cross the X-axis? Which is why we figured out mathematically what the first quartile was and what the third quartile was, because it happens at Q1 and Q3. There are 2 answers, 3 pi over 4 and 9 pi over 4. Is there anyone confused as to how I found the third quartile? Then let's move on. That's example number 3. That's how you're going to do the first 4 questions. Maybe it's the first 5. I can't remember. But then I'm jumping down to number 11 because number 11 has this interval thing that you're going to have to figure out. Let me scrunch it down a little bit. It says sketch the function on the given interval, label all critical points. Hint, start sketching normally, then extend the graph to fill the interval. So this is the part that's new. We're still going to do everything else the same, except we have this extra interval thing that we need. I'll do that in a different color in just a second, but let's go ahead, and my A value lets me know what I should count by. What are you going to count by? Do you know what you're going to label this first line as? It's probably what I would do. I'd go 1/2 and negative 1/2. My B value is 3. So then I do is I figure out what the period has to be. I know that my period has to be 2 pi divided by whatever B is. 3. I can fit 3 periods into 2 pi radians. So that means that my fourth quartile needs to be 2 pi over 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. This fourth quartile is 2 pi over 3. Now, before I even do anything else, I'm going to go through that mnemonic device that we wrote down in part 7c.2. This is a sine graph. Midline, extrema, midline, extrema, midline is what we covered last time. Do I go towards the positive extrema? Do I go towards the negative extrema? Do you remember this A value, what that makes you do? Hoping you see. I'm going to write down my 4 quartiles go midline, negative extrema, midline, extrema, midline. And I just put those 4 dots there because I just want to know what this sine graph is doing. That is that. Now, I am going to start doing this interval thing before I even graph anything. I'm going to switch over to blue real quick. This is what I have to graph. I have to graph from negative 2 pi over 3 to pi over 3. What does that mean? That means I need to have those x values graphed. Okay, this is 2 pi over 3. Where is pi over 3 at? I'm going to do this in blue. If this is 2 pi over 3, where is pi over 3? What's half of 2 pi over 3? Do you know? If you know, tell the person you're sitting next to. I'm hoping you know it's at the second quartile. That if I have 2 pi over 3 and you cut that in half, that makes pi over 3 and another pi over 3 would make 2 pi over 3. That's exactly halfway. So this is the part of the graph that I have to end with. It also lets me know. Gross. Here we go. It also lets me know what I'm counting by. So if I have 2 lines and it's pi over 3, let me go 2 over this way. Do you know what this has to be now? This line right here that I'm pointing at? We went positive pi over 3 this way. What does this have to be? This has to be negative pi over 3. Is that what I want to begin with? I need to go further, don't I? Sometimes you're going to have to extend the graph as needed. How many more lines will I need that are equal distant until I get to negative 2 pi over 3? How many more lines do I need? You are going to have to add 2 lines to get to negative 2 pi over 3. And so that's why I did these in blue, so that you can see I am required to graph from here to here. But I started with these red points so that I knew exactly what the graph does. And all you're going to have to do now is continue the graph. Watch. Midline, extrema, midline. What's going to happen next if I go right to left? Extrema, midline, extrema, midline. There's my answer. Actually, I'm going to change that color to green just so you can see what my final answer needs to be. I'm going to do green highlighter because then it'll be thicker. That green part is my final answer. That green part is in the given interval. I could extend and do more if I want to, but I'm required to graph this bluish green part that I have highlighted because that's the interval that they requested. Any questions? Then I'm going to end your notes right there.